You think because my son put a ring on your finger, you belong at this table? You are nothing but a gutter rat who crawled into a palace, Beatrice spat, her voice dripping with venom loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear. She threw the envelope at Sophie's feet, fake adoption papers meant to humiliate her, to prove she was nobody. Sophie trembled, tears welling in her eyes, ready to run. But then the heavy oak doors of the Sterling estate blasted open. A man in a dark suit walked in, carrying a box stamped with crimson wax. He didn't bow to the billionaire mother-in-law. He bowed to Sophie, and when that box opened, the silence was louder than the screaming. This is the story of how a simple palace seal destroyed a dynasty in seconds. The gravel crunched beneath the tires of the black Range Rover as it wound its way up the driveway of Highgate Manor. To call it a driveway was an insult. It was a mile-long stretch of paved intimidation, flanked by century-old oaks that seemed to whisper, "You don't belong here." Sophie gripped the leather door handle until her knuckles turned white. Beside her, Sage reached over and covered her hand with his. "They are going to love you, Soph," Sage said, though his voice lacked the conviction she needed. "Just be yourself, the same woman who charmed me in that dusty library basement." Sophie forced a smile. "I don't think your mother cares much for dusty library archivists, Sage. She cares about pedigrees, and I'm a blank page." Sophie was an orphan. That was the polite term. The reality was she had been found in a basket on the steps of a convent in Lyon, France, with nothing but a hand-stitched blanket and a strange, heavy iron key around her neck. She had clawed her way up from nothing, earning scholarships, learning 4 languages, and becoming one of the best antique document restorers in New York City. That was how she met Sage Sterling, heir to the Sterling shipping fortune, when he came to restore a family Bible. But to the Sterlings, she wasn't a success story. She was a gold digger with no past, no last name, and no bloodline. The car stopped. The manor loomed above them, a monstrosity of stone and ego. Before the engine even cut, the front door opened. It wasn't a servant. It was Beatrice Sterling herself. Flanking her was her daughter, Caroline. They looked like vultures dressed in Chanel. "Here we go," Sage sighed. As they stepped out, the crisp Connecticut air felt like ice. Beatrice didn't step forward to hug her son. She stayed planted on the top step, forcing them to look up at her. "You're late," Beatrice said, her eyes sliding over Sage and landing directly on Sophie. She scanned Sophie's outfit, a tasteful, modest navy dress, with a look of mild disgust, as if she smelled something rotting. "Traffic, I assume? Or did you have trouble navigating this kind of environment, Sophie?" "The traffic was heavy, Mrs. Sterling," Sophie said, keeping her voice steady. "Your home is beautiful." "It's an estate, dear." "A home is where regular people live," Caroline chimed in, smirking. Caroline was the kind of woman who had never opened a door for herself in her 30 years of life. "And don't worry about your luggage. I'm sure you packed." "Light." "Enough, Caroline," Sage snapped, guiding Sophie up the stairs. "We're here for the anniversary gala. Let's try to have a good weekend." Beatrice turned on her heel, her voice floating back over her shoulder. "We shall see. I've invited the Huntingtons and the Vanderbilts. Try not to embarrass us, Sophie. Oh, and I've moved you to the East Wing guest room. The master suite is being renovated." Sage stiffened. "The East Wing. That's where the staff stays during the summer." "It's perfectly comfortable," Beatrice dismissed them. "Besides, Sophie is used to austere conditions, aren't you? I read that orphanage in Lyon was quite rustic." Sophie froze. She had never told Beatrice the name of the orphanage. Sage must have mentioned it. But the way Beatrice said it, like it was a dirty secret, sent a shiver down Sophie's spine. "It was a convent, Mrs. Sterling," Sophie corrected softly. "The sisters were very kind." Beatrice stopped and turned, her eyes dead and cold. "Kindness is what we give to stray dogs, Sophie. Lineage is what we give to family. Remember that. The weekend was a calculated series of humiliations." At breakfast, the table was set with 7 forks. Sophie, an expert in historical etiquette, knew exactly which one to use. But when she reached for her salad fork, Caroline, accidentally, knocked over a crystal pitcher of water, soaking Sophie's lap. "Oh my God!" Caroline gasped, covering her mouth in mock horror. "I am so clumsy. But really, Sophie, you shouldn't hunch over the table like that." It startled me. While Sophie had to rush to change, she missed the morning conversation where Beatrice handed out family heirlooms to the other guests, antique brooches and cufflinks for the cousins and friends. When Sophie returned, the box was empty. "Oh dear," Beatrice said, buttering a toast. "We seem to have run out. But I suppose you wouldn't have much use for Victorian jewellery. It requires a certain posture to pull off." But the real setup came that afternoon. Sophie had retreated to the library, her safe space. She was admiring a 17th century map on the wall when Beatrice walked in. For the first time, the older woman smiled. It was a terrifying sight. "You like history, don't you?" Beatrice asked, closing the door behind her. "I do," Sophie said, wary. "There is a rumor," Beatrice said, walking over to a large glass display case in the corner, "that my great-grandfather hid the original deed to this estate inside an old puzzle box. But no one has been able to open it for 50 years. Sage says you are good with broken things." She gestured to a wooden box on the table. It was exquisite, inlaid with pearl and ebony. "If you can open it," Beatrice whispered, "perhaps I have misjudged you. Perhaps you do have some utility." Sophie approached the box. It wasn't just a puzzle box. It was a French, intricate locking mechanism from the late 1700s. Sophie's heart beat faster. She had restored one just like this for a museum in Vienna. "I can open it," Sophie said. "Good," Beatrice said. "Bring it to the gala dinner tonight. Open it in front of everyone as a surprise for my husband. He's been dying to see what's inside. Do this, and you're part of the family." Sophie felt a surge of hope. It was a test, a difficult one, but one she could pass. She spent the next 3 hours carefully manipulating the hidden tumblers, listening to the faint clicks of the ancient wood. Finally, with a soft thud, the lid popped up. Inside, there was a velvet pouch. Sophie didn't look inside the pouch. She wanted to respect the privacy of the family. She simply relocked the box, ready to perform the trick at dinner. She felt proud. She finally had a way to contribute. She didn't see Caroline watching from the doorway, recording a video on her phone, a cruel smile playing on her lips. She didn't know that the box had already been opened 2 hours ago by a locksmith Beatrice hired, and she certainly didn't know what Beatrice had planted inside the velvet pouch. The gala dinner was an exercise in excess. The dining hall was lit by 3 chandeliers, each costing more than the orphanage that raised Sophie. 30 guests sat at the long mahogany table, men in tuxedos, women in gowns that cost a year's salary. Sophie wore an emerald green dress Sage had bought her. She looked stunning, but she felt small. The conversation was dominated by Arthur Sterling, Sage's father, boasting about his latest acquisition of a tech firm in Silicon Valley. Sage held Sophie's hand under the table, giving it a squeeze. "Mother has a surprise," Sage whispered. "She's actually letting you do a toast." "Better," Sophie whispered back. "I solved the grandfather box." Sage's eyes went wide. "No way. That thing has been sealed since 1970. At the head of the table, Beatrice tapped her spoon against her champagne glass. The room fell silent. "Friends, family," Beatrice began, her voice smooth as silk. "Tonight is about legacy. It is about the purity of our line and the treasures we pass down. Speaking of treasures, Sage's new bride, Sophie, claims to have a special talent." Beatrice gestured to Sophie. "She claims she has unlocked the grandfather box, a feat no Sterling has managed in decades." Polite applause rippled through the room, but the eyes were skeptical. Sophie stood up, her legs shaking slightly. She held the wooden box. "Thank you, Beatrice," Sophie said. "It is an honor to be included in your history." She performed the sequence. Click, turn, slide, click. The room watched in silence. With a final flourish, the lid sprang open. "Bravo!" Arthur Sterling shouted, genuinely impressed. "By God, she did it!" "Open it, Sophie," Beatrice commanded, her voice dropping an octave. "Show us the legacy." Sophie reached in and pulled out the velvet pouch. She loosened the drawstrings and upturned it into her hand. She expected a deed, or a diamond. Instead, a heavy, tarnished silver bracelet fell onto her palm. A collective gasp went through the room. It wasn't a Sterling heirloom. It was a prison shackle, a small, symbolic iron cuff, etched with a number. Sophie stared at it, confused. I don't understand." "Neither do we," Beatrice said, standing up abruptly. "That is not the Sterling deed. That is trash." Beatrice walked over, snatched the cuff from Sophie's hand, and held it up to the light. Then she pulled a piece of paper from her pocket. "I had a feeling," Beatrice announced to the room, "so I did some digging. I hired a private investigator to look into that convent of yours in Lyon." Beatrice threw the paper on the table. It slid across the polished wood and stopped in front of Sage. "It wasn't just a convent, was it, Sophie?" Beatrice's voice rose to a shout. "It was a halfway house for the children of criminals. Your mother wasn't a tragedy. She was a thief, a convicted felon who died in prison. And that shackle? That's probably the only inheritance she left you." The room was dead silent. Sophie felt the blood drain from her face. "That's not true. The sisters lied to protect a bastard child," Beatrice screamed. "You are not a restorer of history. You are a fraud. You wormed your way into my son's bed to steal our fortune, just like your mother stole jewelry." "Mother, stop!" Sage stood up, knocking his chair over. "That's enough." "Is it?" Caroline stood up too, pulling out her phone. "Look at this, everyone." She played the video on the large screen TV mounted on the wall. It was the video of Sophie in the library earlier, but it was edited. It showed Sophie opening the box, looking around suspiciously, and slipping something into her pocket, which was actually her polishing cloth, then appearing to swap the contents. "She stole the real heirloom!" Caroline shrieked. "She stole the deed and replaced it with that junk." "No!" Sophie cried out, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't! That's edited! Sage, please!" Sage looked at the video, then at his mother, then at Sophie. The doubt in his eyes was heartbreaking. For a second, just 1 second, he hesitated. "Sophie," Sage stammered. Why does it look like you took something?" That hesitation broke her heart more than Beatrice's screaming. "I didn't," Sophie whispered. "Get out," Beatrice hissed, pointing to the door. "Get out of my house. The police are already on their way. I will have you arrested for grand larceny and fraud. You will rot in a cell, just like your mother." The guests murmured, looking at Sophie with pure disgust. She was cornered, alone, accused of a crime she didn't commit, stripped of her dignity, and rejected by the man she loved. She turned to leave, her vision blurred by tears. She reached for the door handle, but before she could turn it, the massive double doors of the banquet hall exploded inward. Bam! The sound was so loud several guests screamed. 2 men in tactical gear stepped in, securing the room. Behind them walked a tall, elderly man with silver hair and a posture so regal it made the Sterlings look like peasants. He wore a dark suit with a red lapel pin. He carried a briefcase handcuffed to his wrist. "Who the hell are you?" Arthur Sterling bellowed, his face red. "This is private property." The man ignored Arthur completely. He walked straight into the center of the room, his eyes scanning the faces until they locked onto Sophie. The room fell into a terrified silence. The man walked up to Sophie, who was trembling against the doorframe. He stopped. He clicked his heels together. And then, in front of the billionaires, the socialites, and the arrogant Sterlings, The stranger dropped to one knee and bowed his head low. "Forgive my tardiness, Your Highness," the man said, his voice ringing with authority. The royal guard had trouble clearing the airspace. Beatrice let out a dry, confused laugh. "Your Highness?" The man stood up, turned to Beatrice, and his expression hardened into granite. He lifted the briefcase, unlocked the cuffs, and set it on the table, sweeping Beatrice's wine glass onto the floor to make space. "I am Ambassador Hugo de Vries of the Duchy of Valois," he announced, "and I am here to verify the identity of the Crown Princess Sophia Marie de Valois, and to issue a formal declaration of war against anyone who has detained her." He opened the case. Inside sat a heavy scroll and a massive, golden seal, the palace seal. The silence in the dining hall was heavy, pressing down on the guests like a physical weight. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the frantic, shallow breathing of Caroline Sterling, who had turned a shade of pale usually reserved for the dead. Beatrice was the first to break the paralysis. She didn't bow. She didn't apologize. She laughed. It was a shrill, manic sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "Oh, this is rich," Beatrice scoffed, stepping over the shattered glass of her wine goblet. "This is your best con yet, Sophie. Hiring an actor? Ambassador de Vries? Please, I know every diplomat in the tri-state area. You are a nobody." She turned to the security guards she had hired earlier. "Remove this old fool and the girl. Use force if you have to." The two Sterling security guards stepped forward, hands reaching for their batons. "I wouldn't," a voice thundered from the doorway. 6 men in dark grey tactical suits, wearing emblems of a golden griffin on their chests, swept into the room. They moved with a fluidity that screamed special forces, not mall cops. In seconds, the Sterling security team was disarmed and forced to their knees, hands zip-tied behind their backs. Arthur Sterling stood up, knocking his chair over. "Now see here, you can't just—" "Sit down, Mr. Sterling," Hugo de Vries said, not even looking at him. His attention was solely on Sophie. Sophie looked at the old man, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Who are you? You said— Princess?" Hugo smiled, a warm, grandfatherly expression that softened his iron features. "Sophie, do you still have the key? The one the sisters told you never to take off?" Sophie's hand flew to her throat. She pulled the simple iron chain from beneath the collar of her emerald dress. Hanging there was the heavy, dull iron key she had worn since she was a baby. It looked like something that would open a garden shed, not a palace. "I have it," she said. "That key," Beatrice interrupted, rolling her eyes, "is probably for a locker at a bus station." Hugo ignored her. He picked up the heavy golden seal he had placed on the table. He turned it over. On the bottom of the palace seal was a complex, indented groove. "Give it to me, Your Highness," Hugo requested gently. Sophie unclasped the necklace and handed the key to him. Hugo inserted the head of the iron key into the bottom of the golden seal. It wasn't just a key. It was the missing component of the royal stamp. With a satisfying click, the key locked into the gold base, completing the crest of the griffin. Hugo took a candle from the table, dripped red wax onto a napkin, and pressed the combined seal into it. He lifted it. The image was perfect. The royal crest of Valois. "The iron key is the safeguard," Hugo explained to the room, his voice projecting like an orator. "During the midnight coup 25 years ago, the king, your father, split the royal seal. He kept the gold, but he gave the iron key to his most trusted servant, along with his infant daughter. He knew the usurpers could steal the gold, but without the key they could never legitimize their rule. They could never sign laws or access the royal treasury." Hugo turned his piercing blue eyes onto Beatrice. "You called her mother a thief, Mrs. Sterling. The woman who raised Sophie wasn't her mother. She was Countess Elin, the royal nanny. She wasn't arrested for stealing jewelry. She was arrested by the rebel regime for kidnapping the heir to the throne. She died in prison, refusing to give up Sophie's location." She was a martyr, a hero, not a criminal. Sophie felt the floor sway beneath her. The narrative of her life, the shame of being unwanted, the fear of bad blood, shattered in an instant. She wasn't the daughter of a criminal. She was the daughter of a king who had died to save her, and a woman who had sacrificed everything to hide her. She looked at Sage. Sage was staring at her, his mouth slightly open. But it wasn't a look of love, it was a look of calculation. He was processing the new data: princess, royalty, Valois. "Sophie," Sage said, his voice cracking. He took a step toward her. I didn't know." "Stay back," Hugo commanded, stepping between them. "You lost the right to approach her when you stood silent, while your mother called her a gutter rat." "I was confused," Sage pleaded, looking at Sophie. "Soph, look at the video Caroline showed. It looked real. I was just asking for an explanation." "No, Sage," Sophie said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a razor. "You hesitated. You looked at me, and you saw a thief. You didn't see your wife. You saw what your mother wanted you to see." "This is ridiculous," Beatrice shrieked. She was losing control of the room, and she knew it. She grabbed her phone. "I don't care if she's the Queen of Sheba. She is in my house, and she stole my heirloom. The video proves it. Officer?" She waved at a confused local police officer who had just arrived at the front door, summoned by Beatrice's earlier call. "Officer," Beatrice yelled, "arrest this woman. She stole a diamond bracelet and replaced it with this trash." She pointed to the prison cuff on the table. The officer looked at the tactical team, then at the ambassador, and hesitated. "Ma'am, these men seem to have diplomatic credentials." "I don't care," Beatrice screamed. "I have proof. Caroline, show him the video." Caroline fumbled with her phone, her hands shaking. She tapped the screen. "Here, look." Hugo de Vries sighed, as if bored. "Technician." One of the tactical guards pulled out a tablet. "Already accessed, sir. The Wi-Fi in this house is remarkably insecure." Suddenly the large screen TV on the wall flickered. Caroline's video disappeared. In its place, a new video feed appeared. "What is this?" Caroline gasped. "This," Hugo said, "is the footage from the hidden security camera in your own library, the one you apparently forgot about when you edited your little clip." The video played. It showed the library from a high angle. It showed Sophie opening the box, smiling, and leaving the room to get her polishing kit. Then it showed Caroline entering the room. The guests watched in stunned silence as the high-definition screen showed Caroline Sterling opening the box. She laughed, reached into her bra, and pulled out the prison shackle. She swapped the contents, putting the real velvet pouch into her pocket and placing the shackle in the box. Then she pulled out her phone and staged the angle she later showed at dinner. The video ended. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Every eye turned to Caroline. Caroline stammered, backing away. "It was a joke. It was just a prank. Mother, tell them." Beatrice looked at her daughter, then at the screen, and then at the ambassador. Her face went from red to a ghostly white. The setup had backfired in the most catastrophic way possible. "You framed a head of state," Hugo said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "In my country, that is treason. In yours, I believe it is fraud, defamation, and falsification of evidence." Hugo turned to the police officer, who looked ready to faint. "Officer, I believe you were called here to make an arrest." The officer swallowed hard. He reached for his handcuffs and walked toward Caroline. "Mrs. Caroline Sterling," the officer said, his voice wavering. "Please put your hands behind your back." "Mother!" Caroline screamed as the cuffs clicked. "Do something! Daddy!" Arthur Sterling sat with his head in his hands, refusing to look up. He knew the game was over. But Beatrice wasn't done. Her narcissism wouldn't allow her to lose. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on Sophie. "Fine," Beatrice spat. "So she's a princess, so Caroline played a trick. But this is still my house, and you are trespassing. I want you all out, immediately, or I will sue your little country into bankruptcy. Do you know who we are? We are the Sterlings. We control the shipping lanes." Hugo laughed. It was a dark, dry sound. "Mr. Sterling," Hugo addressed Arthur, ignoring Beatrice. "Do you want to tell your wife, or should I?" Arthur looked up, his face grey. "Beatrice, shut up." "Excuse me?" Beatrice gasped. "Shut up," Arthur roared, slamming his fist on the table. "Do you know where our shipping fleet refuels in the Mediterranean? Port Valois. It's our primary hub. If the Duchy of Valois closes its ports to Sterling ships, our stock drops to 0 by morning. We will be bankrupt in a week." Arthur looked at Sophie, his eyes pleading. "Your Highness, please, my wife. She is unwell. She didn't mean it." Sophie looked at the family that had tormented her, the mother who mocked her poverty, the sister-in-law who framed her, the husband who didn't trust her. She stood tall, the posture of a queen coming naturally to her now. "Ambassador," Sophie said softly. "Yes, Your Highness? I am ready to leave. Please collect my things. All of them. Of course." "Sophie, wait!" Sage rushed forward, grabbing her arm. One of the royal guards moved to intercept, but Sophie held up a hand. She looked at Sage's hand on her arm, the arm he had pledged to hold forever. "Don't go," Sage whispered, tears in his eyes. "We can fix this. I love you. I'm sorry I hesitated. It was just... everything happened so fast. You know I love you." Sophie gently removed his hand from her arm. "You loved the idea of saving me, Sage," she said sadly. "You loved the poor orphan girl who needed you. But a queen doesn't need saving. She needs a partner, and you proved tonight that you are not him. Sophie, goodbye, Sage." She turned and walked toward the door, flanked by her guards. As she reached the threshold, Beatrice yelled out one last desperate venom. "Go ahead, run away. But you'll always be a bastard. You have no money. That country of yours is a war zone. You'll be begging to come back to this luxury within a month." Sophie stopped. She didn't turn around. "Ambassador," she said, "what is the current estimate of the Valois Royal Treasury?" Hugo smiled. "With the recovery of the seal, the Swiss accounts are unlocked. Approximately 4 billion euros, Your Highness, plus the real estate holdings in Paris and Monaco." "And now..." The gasp from the dinner guests sucked the air out of the room. Sophie walked out into the cool night air, the heavy oak doors of Highgate Manor slamming shut behind her, sealing her past away forever. The week following the gala was a media hurricane. The video of Caroline being arrested was leaked, not by the Sterlings, but by one of the guests, a Vanderbilt cousin who had secretly hated Beatrice for years. It went viral instantly. #Sterling scandal was trending worldwide. For Sophie, however, the world was quiet. She was whisked away to the penthouse of the Pierre Hotel in Manhattan, which the Valois government maintained as a diplomatic residence. It was a strange transition. She went from scrubbing antique parchment in a basement to having a team of stylists, legal advisors, and security personnel. But she wasn't happy. The betrayal cut deep. She sat on the balcony, overlooking Central Park, the iron key, now resting in a velvet box on her vanity. Hugo sat across from her, sipping tea. "You are grieving him," Hugo observed. "I'm grieving the version of him I thought existed," Sophie corrected. "I keep wondering, if I hadn't been a princess, if I really had been the daughter of a thief, would he have let me go to jail?" Hugo didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew the answer. "We have business to discuss, Your Highness," Hugo said, changing the subject. "The coronation is scheduled for next month in Valois, but there are complications." "What kind of complications?" "Your uncle, the man who staged the coup. He has fled the country since we announced your return, but his financial tendrils are deep. He has been using a shell company to launder money out of Valois for years. We need to freeze those assets to rebuild the country." "Okay," Sophie said. "So we freeze them." It is not that simple. The shell company is a silent partner in a major American corporation. We cannot touch the assets without the cooperation of the CEO of that corporation. Sophie felt a cold knot in her stomach. Which corporation, Hugo? Hugo placed a file on the table. Sterling Shipping. Sophie closed her eyes and let out a long breath. Of course. Arthur Sterling was laundering money for the regime that killed my father, she asked. Likely unknowingly, Hugo clarified. Arthur is a greedy man, but not a murderer. He likely just saw a cheap investment opportunity. But legally, he holds the keys. If we try to seize the money, he can tie us up in international court for a decade. By then, your uncle will have vanished with the funds. So we need Arthur Sterling's help, Sophie said bitterly. We need him to voluntarily surrender the accounts. Yes. And considering we just had his daughter arrested and threatened to bankrupt his company, he is uncooperative. Sophie stood up and walked to the railing. The city lights blurred before her eyes. She wanted to be done with the Sterlings. She wanted to erase them. But fate had a cruel sense of humor. Set up a meeting, Sophie said. With Arthur? No, Sophie turned, her eyes hard. With Sage. Arthur is too proud. He's terrified of Beatrice. But Sage is desperate for forgiveness. We will use that. The meeting was not held at the Sterling estate, nor was it held at the Valois diplomatic residence. It took place on neutral ground, a glass-walled conference room on the 45th floor of a high-power law firm in Midtown Manhattan. The view outside was breathtaking, a sprawl of skyscrapers reaching for the grey sky, but inside the temperature felt like it had dropped below freezing. Sophie sat at the head of the long, polished obsidian table. She was no longer the woman who had worn a simple navy dress to meet her in-laws. Today, she wore a tailored white suit that cost more than the annual budget of the orphanage where she was raised. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant chignon, and her posture was steel. To her right sat Hugo de Vries, looking less like a kindly grandfather and more like a shark in a three-piece suit. To her left were two corporate attorneys from a top-tier international firm, their faces blank and unreadable. They were waiting. When the door finally opened, Sage Sterling walked in alone. The transformation was shocking. Gone was the confident, golden-haired heir who had charmed Sophie in the library. In his place was a man who looked like he hadn't slept since the night the doors of Highgate Manor had slammed shut. His designer suit hung loosely on his frame, his tie was slightly crooked, and there was a shadow of stubble on his jaw. He looked hollowed out. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes locking onto Sophie. For a moment he just stared, seemingly unable to reconcile the woman sitting in the power seat with the girl he had promised to protect. "Sophie," he breathed, his voice rough. He took an instinctive step toward her, his hand reaching out. "Soph, Sit down, Mr. Sterling," Sophie said. Her voice wasn't angry. It was calm, detached, and utterly cold. She didn't stand to greet him. She didn't offer a hand. Sage flinched as if he'd been slapped. He looked at Hugo, then back at Sophie, realizing the distance between them was now an ocean. He pulled out the heavy leather chair at the opposite end of the table and sat, looking small in the vast room. "I've been calling," Sage said, his voice trembling slightly. "I've left voicemails. I sent flowers to the hotel. I tried to come see you, but your security. My security is doing their job," Sophie cut him off, her tone sharp. "And I didn't bring you here to talk about floral arrangements, Sage. We are here to talk about treason." Sage blinked, confused. "Treason? What are you talking about?" Hugo de Vries slid a thick black folder across the polished table. It stopped inches from Sage's hands. "Read it," Hugo commanded. Sage opened the file. As he scanned the pages, his face went from pale to a sickly shade of grey. He flipped through bank transfers, shipping manifests, and emails. This is impossible," Sage stammered. These are transfers from sterling shipping accounts to shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Shell companies owned by the regime that usurped the throne of Valois, Hugo clarified, his voice dripping with disdain. Your father's company has been moving funds for a criminal syndicate for 5 years. He has been laundering the money stolen from the Valois treasury. He didn't know, Sage said quickly, looking up with wide, panicked eyes. My father is a shark, yes, but he's not a traitor. He wouldn't knowingly fund a coup. He probably just thought it was a tax haven. In the eyes of the International Court and the US Patriot Act, ignorance is not a defense, Sophie said, leaning forward slightly. Technically, the United States government has enough evidence in that folder to seize sterling shipping entirely. They can freeze every asset your family owns. They can throw your father in a federal supermax prison for financing terrorism. The sentence would be life. The silence that followed was deafening. The hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. Sage looked down at the papers, his hands shaking. He knew she was right. His family was staring into the abyss. Why are you showing me this? Sage asked, his voice barely a whisper. Why not just arrest him? Because that takes time, Sophie replied, and my country doesn't have time. My people need those funds now to rebuild. We need the schools reopened. We need the hospitals stocked. I cannot wait 5 years for a federal trial to conclude. She signaled to the lawyer on her left, who slid a single document across the table. I am offering you a deal, Sage. Sage looked at the document. It was a waiver. I need the funds frozen and transferred back to the Valois Royal Treasury immediately, Sophie outlined, her voice businesslike. I need a public statement from Sterling Shipping, admitting to the oversight, denouncing the former regime, and agreeing to full cooperation. In exchange, I will petition the State Department to treat this as a civil compliance issue rather than a criminal one. Your father stays out of prison, your family keeps their freedom, but you lose the money. Sage read the terms. It was a financial death sentence for the company. The stock would tank, their reputation would be ruined, they would lose billions, but it would save his father's life. I have the authority, Sage murmured, more to himself than anyone else. As COO, I can sign off on compliance settlements. I can do this. He picked up the heavy fountain pen lying on the table. He hovered the nib over the signature line. Then he stopped. He looked up at Sophie, his eyes searching hers, looking for a trace of the woman who used to read old books with him in the dusty light of the archive. If I do this, Sage started, his voice cracking with emotion. If I bankrupt my family to help you, if I choose you over them, will you forgive me? Hugo shifted uncomfortably in his seat, ready to intervene, but Sophie held up a hand. Will you give me another chance? Sage pleaded, the desperation pouring out of him. I know I messed up. I know I hesitated at the dinner. But look at what I'm doing now. I'm handing you everything. Doesn't that prove I love you? The room went silent. Sophie looked at the man she had planned to marry. She saw the pain in his eyes. She saw the sincerity. He really believed that this gesture could fix the broken glass of their relationship. But Sophie wasn't looking at a fairy tale anymore. She was looking at reality. Sage, she said softly, her voice tinged with a sadness that was far heavier than anger. You aren't doing this for me. I am. No, Sophie corrected him gently. You are doing this to save your father from dying in a prison cell. You are doing this because you are cornered. Do not confuse a transaction with affection. That's not fair, Sage protested, tears welling in his eyes. I'm destroying my legacy for you. You should have stood up for me when it cost you nothing, Sophie said, her words cutting through the air like a knife. At the dinner, when your mother called me a thief, when she called me a rat, you didn't need to give up your fortune, Sage. You just needed to speak. You just needed to hold my hand and tell them they were wrong. But you didn't. You looked at the video, and you doubted me. You hesitated. Sage flinched. He remembered the moment, the split second where he wondered if his wife was a criminal. "I was confused," he whispered. "A king does not get confused about the character of his queen," Sophie said, finally standing up. She loomed over the table, regal and unreachable. "You loved the idea of saving a poor orphan girl, Sage. It made you feel strong, but a queen doesn't need saving. She needs a partner, and you proved that night that you are not him." Sage stared at her. The truth of her words settled over him like a shroud. He realized then that the power dynamic had shifted permanently. He wasn't the billionaire heir rescuing the damsel. He was a petitioner begging a monarch, and he had been denied. He looked down at the paper. His hand trembled. He signed it. Sage Sterling. The scratch of the pen against the paper was the sound of an empire falling. "Thank you," Sophie said. She didn't smile. She signaled Hugo, who immediately snatched the document and placed it into his briefcase. "The transfer will be initiated within the hour," Hugo said. "You made the right choice, Mr. Sterling." Sophie turned to leave. Her guards opened the door. "Sophie, wait!" Sage called out. She paused in the doorway, her back to him. Sage stood up, gripping the edge of the table. He had lost her. He knew that now. But there was one last thing he owed her. "My mother," Sage said, his voice low and urgent. She knows about the foreclosure notices. She knows everything is crumbling. She's not handling it well." Sophie turned her head slightly, acknowledging him. "She's been on the phone with tabloids all morning," Sage warned. "She's planning something. I don't know what, but she's desperate. She's like a wounded animal. She wants to burn it all down before she leaves. Please, be careful." Sophie looked at him one last time. For a fleeting second, her expression softened. "Thank you for the warning, Sage," she said. And then she walked out. The heavy glass door clicked shut, leaving Sage Sterling alone in the cold, silent room, surrounded by the wreckage of his life. "He still loves you," Hugo noted quietly as they stepped into the private elevator. "He loves the memory of me," Sophie said, staring at her reflection in the polished brass doors. "He loves the ghost of the girl he thought he could control. That girl is gone." She straightened her jacket. "Now, let's get that money back to my people." But as the elevator descended, Sophie felt a chill. Sage's warning had been genuine. Beatrice Sterling was a narcissist who had never been told no in her life, and now that she was losing everything, she wouldn't go quietly. She would try to take the Queen down with her. 2 weeks had passed since the doors of Highgate Manor slammed shut, but the echoes of that night were still reverberating across the Atlantic. The world was split into 2 distinct stages. On one side of the ocean lay the small, sun-drenched coastal nation of Valois. The air there smelled of sea salt and jasmine. The streets were draped in bunting of azure and gold, the national colours. The atmosphere was electric with hope. The return of the lost princess had ignited a patriotism the country hadn't felt in a generation. On the other side of the ocean, in a frigid, overly air-conditioned television studio in Midtown Manhattan, the atmosphere was toxic. Beatrice Sterling sat in the makeup chair, her face a mask of foundation, designed to hide the stress lines that had deepened over the last fortnight. She had lost her social standing. The invitations to the galas had stopped coming. Her friends in the Hamptons were suddenly vacationing elsewhere. Even the doorman at her favourite club had looked at her with pity. Beatrice Sterling did not accept pity. She demanded obedience. Desperate, ostracized, and with her daughter Caroline currently sitting in a holding cell facing 3 years for evidence tampering, Beatrice had decided to scorch the earth. She had booked an exclusive live interview with The Daily Truth, a tabloid talk show notorious for its lack of journalistic integrity and its hunger for scandal. "5 minutes to air, Mrs. Sterling," a production assistant said, avoiding eye contact. "Make sure the lighting is soft," Beatrice snapped, checking her reflection. "I want to look sympathetic, a grieving mother." Across the ocean, inside the royal palace of Valois, the mood was solemn. In the private dressing chambers, Sophie stood before a floor-to-length mirror. She was no longer wearing the practical clothes of an archivist. She was draped in the ceremonial robes of the sovereign, white silk embroidered with silver thread, and a heavy velvet cape the colour of deep ocean water. Hugo de Vries stood by the window, holding a tablet. His knuckles were white. "You should not watch this, Your Highness," Hugo advised, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "It is beneath you. She is a desperate woman screaming into the void." "Turn it up, Hugo," Sophie said calmly. She didn't turn away from the mirror. She was adjusting the clasp of the iron key, which she wore not hidden, but proudly displayed over the royal silks. Hugo sighed and tapped the screen. The audio of the Daily Truth filled the ornate chamber. "She fooled us all," Beatrice was saying to the host, tears shimmering in her eyes, a performance worthy of an Oscar. The camera zoomed in tight. Sophie isn't a princess. She is a master manipulator, a con artist of the highest order. That seal she produced, a forgery, a prop she likely built in that dusty workshop of hers. The host, a woman named Diane, who thrived on conflict, leaned in. "Those are serious accusations, Mrs. Sterling. The State Department has recognized her claim." "The State Department was duped," Beatrice cried, her voice cracking. "She brainwashed my poor son. She destroyed my daughter's life, planting evidence to frame her. And now she's playing dress-up in a stolen castle while my family suffers. I have documents here, school records, proving she was expelled for pathological lying when she was 12. Beatrice waved a sheaf of papers in the air. They were crude forgeries, purchased from a disbarred lawyer in Queens the night before. But on camera, they looked official. In the palace, Hugo looked ready to throw the tablet through the window. "This is slander. It is treasonous libel on the day of your coronation. I will call the network legal department. I will have the feed cut within 60 seconds. "No," Sophie said. She turned around, the heavy cape sweeping across the floor. Her expression was terrifyingly serene. "Do not cut the feed. Let her speak. Let her pour every drop of poison she has. I want the world to see exactly who she is." "But Your Highness, she is damaging the legitimacy of the crown. She is controlling the narrative." "She controls nothing," Sophie said. She walked over to an antique mahogany desk where a secure satellite phone sat. "Beatrice thinks this is a media war. She doesn't realize it's a financial execution." Sophie picked up the receiver and dialed a number she had memorized. "Who are you calling?" Hugo asked, confused. "The Royal Treasury's contact in Zurich," Sophie replied, "and through them, the Global Banking Consortium, specifically the bank that holds the private mortgage on Highgate Manor." Back in New York, Beatrice was gaining momentum. The audience in the studio was murmuring, swaying to her side. She was selling the narrative of the victim billionaire with surprising effectiveness. "We took her in," Beatrice sobbed, dabbing her nose with a monogrammed tissue. "We fed her. We gave her a seat at our table when she had nothing. And how did she repay us? She bit the hand that fed her. She is a viper." Suddenly the host, Diane, touched her earpiece. Her expression shifted from sympathetic intrigue to confusion, then to shock. Diane held up a hand. "I'm sorry to interrupt. Mrs. Sterling, I have more," Beatrice insisted. "I haven't even told you about the jewelry she stole from my bedroom." "Mrs. Sterling, please," Diane cut her off, her voice sharper. She looked at the teleprompter, squinting as new text scrolled rapidly across it. We have some breaking news coming in. It seems to be directly related to the Sterling family." Beatrice froze. A flicker of genuine fear appeared behind her eyes. "To me? What kind of news?" "Yes," Diane said, looking at the camera. "We are receiving confirmed reports from Wall Street. The board of directors of Sterling Shipping has just concluded an emergency vote." Beatrice scoffed nervously. "That's impossible. My husband, Arthur, is the chairman. He calls the votes." "Not anymore," Diane said, reading the bulletin. "It appears that federal investigators uncovered a massive money laundering scheme tied to the former regime of Valois. To avoid immediate federal prosecution, and the seizure of all assets, Arthur Sterling agreed to a plea deal. Beatrice gripped the arms of her chair. What deal? To pay the massive international fines, Diane continued, relentless. The Sterling family was forced to liquidate their controlling stake in the company. The shares were purchased in a block sale 5 minutes ago. Purchased by whom? Beatrice whispered, her face draining of colour. By the Royal Treasury of Valois, Diane announced. A gasp went through the studio audience. Beatrice sat stunned. Her family's legacy, the shipping empire built over 3 generations, was gone. It now belonged to the country she had just called a war zone. And, Diane added, pressing her hand to her earpiece again, there is more. We are going live to Connecticut. The giant screen behind the 2 women shifted. The image of the studio vanished, replaced by a live helicopter shot hovering over Highgate Manor. Beatrice stood up, her knees shaking. What is this? The driveway was filled with activity, but it wasn't a party. There were 3 moving trucks, several police cruisers with flashing lights, and men in uniforms placing yellow tape across the grand entrance. It seems the mortgage on the estate has been called in, Diane explained. The host was no longer pretending to be sympathetic. She was witnessing a train wreck and couldn't look away. The property has been foreclosed upon by the new note holder due to a violation of character clause and default on the new terms. Mrs. Sterling, are you aware that you are currently being evicted? Evicted? Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill shriek. We have lived there for 30 years. Who is doing this? Who bought the debt? Diane listened to her producer one last time. She looked Beatrice dead in the eye, a mix of pity and awe on her face. The deed was purchased 10 minutes ago by a private trust. The Sophia Marie Trust. Beatrice collapsed back into her chair. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every pixel of her devastation. Sophie hadn't just sued her. She hadn't just argued with her. She had bought the very roof over Beatrice's head, the company that funded her lifestyle, and kicked her out onto the street, live on national television. In the dressing room of the palace, Sophie watched Beatrice slump into the chair, a broken woman. There was no joy in Sophie's eyes, only a quiet, resolute finality. She reached out and pressed the button on the tablet, turning the screen to black. It is done, she said softly. Outside, the heavy bronze bells of the Cathedral of St. Jude began to toll. Bong, bong, bong. They are waiting for you, Your Majesty, Hugo said, bowing lower than he ever had before. Sophie walked out of the chamber, down the long hall of kings, and stepped out onto the grand balcony. Below her, the square was a sea of people. Thousands of faces looked up. They weren't cheering for a bloodline. They weren't cheering for power. They were cheering for the woman who had returned the stolen treasury, who had funded the schools, and who had faced down the tyrants, both the political ones who stole her country and the personal ones who tried to steal her dignity. Sophie raised her hand, and the roar of the crowd was deafening. Deep within that sea of people, obscured by the hood of a travel-worn coat, a young man watched. Sage Sterling had flown economy class to Valois, spending the last of his personal savings. He wasn't there to beg. He wasn't there to fight. He was there to witness. He watched as the Archbishop placed the heavy, glittering crown of Valois on Sophie's head. He saw the strength in her posture, a strength he had failed to protect. He saw the happiness in her eyes, a happiness he realized he could never have given her, because he was too afraid of his mother to let her shine. The crowd chanted, a rhythmic, thundering sound. Long live the Queen! Long live the Queen! Sage smiled. It was a sad, broken smile, but it was genuine. Tears pricked his eyes, blurring the image of the woman in white on the balcony. Long live the Queen, he whispered into the wind. He turned his back on the palace. He began to push his way through the cheering crowd, walking towards the train station, disappearing into anonymity. He knew, with absolute certainty, that while he had lost everything, the woman he loved had finally found exactly where she belonged. Sophie looked out over her people. Her hand drifted up to her chest, feeling the cold, hard shape of the iron key beneath the royal jewels. It was her anchor. It was a reminder. She had been a blank page, a gutter rat, an orphan. Now she was Her Majesty, and she would never, ever let anyone make her feel small again. Sophie's journey from a ridiculed orphan to a queen proves one undeniable truth. Your worth is never defined by the people who cannot see your value. The Sterlings possessed billions of dollars, but they were bankrupt in class, dignity, and honor. Sophie had nothing but an old iron key and a resilient heart, and in the end, that was the only currency that truly mattered. The next time someone tries to make you feel like you don't belong at their table, remember Sophie. Maybe you don't need a seat at their table. Maybe you are meant to build your own castle. If you enjoyed this story of royal justice and sweet revenge, please hit the like button right now. It really helps us bring more stories like this to you. What would you have done if you were Sophie? Would you have forgiven Sage, or did he get what he deserved? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching.